How's it going, everyone? It is I, Anime Outlet, and this is part 4 of What If Deku Had Ultra Instinct. And now, before I start this What If off, I would like to tell you all that I now have a Twitter, a link in the description to that. It's basically just another platform you all can get notifications for when I uploaded a video, or just the thumbnail to a new video that's either coming out that day or in a couple days from then. So, a link in the description to that. And also, I'd like to shout out True Beta, a link in the description to their channel for making the thumbnails for this series. And now, let's begin. Weeks would end up passing as Izuku would walk into the classroom, knowing that the day was finally the day that the UA Sports Festival was going to occur. Over the past weeks, Izuku has been training many quirkless people so that they could harness the power and ability of Ki, teaching many of them how to use Ki and all of its different tricks that came with it. Now, there would be prodigies within the group of quirkless people and people that just couldn't get it. But all those people would end up helping, as numbers would end up being working better than a few select people that were very, very good at using Ki. As Izuku knew, All For One was building a massive army, and if there was only a few of them that knew how to use Ki very well, they were going to lose, and that was just plain and simple. So Izuku, walking into class, would end up sitting down, looking towards the front board, waiting for Aizawa to walk into the room. Aizawa would walk in looking sleep-deprived as always, as he would then look towards the class before speaking. "Alright, class, you know the drill. Just like we practiced yesterday, go down to the locker rooms and grab your hero suitcase." Which, not actually, of course. You're gonna want to grab your PE uniforms and then walk out to the bus. It's sort of a trick to install it into your mind that you're grabbing your hero costume. And of course, if you grab your hero costume, you're not going to be able to compete. So make sure you grab the right one. Aizawa would say before telling all the students they have 20 minutes to go do that, as many of them would then end up panicking, rushing down to the locker rooms were, as many of the other classes who were also panicking, wanting to do the UA Sports Festival as well, were running down there too. Now, the reason many of these classes were also running down there as they had to get there first before any of the other classes, and that's because if the classes didn't make it there in time, their spots would end up being filled by a bunch of quirkless people, and those being the people Izuku trained. So Izuku would end up walking down and just grabbing his suitcase, which happened to have his PE uniform inside. So Izuku would end up walking out and sitting onto the bus, as Aizawa would see this but not say anything. So when the entire class would end up walking in, having their PE uniform in hand, some of them even changing into it, they would see Izuku standing there with his briefcase, as many of them would start to laugh before one of them would point it out to Izuku. "Izuku, you do know you have your hero suitcase, right? Your PE uniform shouldn't be in there." As Izuku would then start to laugh. "Oh, that's why I have it in here, actually. I just thought how many of you I'd fool with it." As Izuku would then start to laugh, as some of the class would think, "Oh wow, he actually fooled us by putting it inside. That's a really stupid trick." So Izuku would end up sitting there as the entire class would end up making it before walking inside the UA Sports Festival, just Coliseum building, before they would then be split up into the boys and girls locker room and would then be getting changed, as they would then be filed into a waiting room, waiting for it to actually begin. Now outside, all of the other classes that weren't Class 1 or Class 1B, or Class 1A and Class 1B, they would actually have to be taking a test by flipping a coin. If they landed on heads, they could compete. If they landed on tails, their spot would be filled by a quirkless person. However, UA would end up making it up to them somehow. So many people would end up flipping this coin and would sadly lose their spots to someone who was quirkless. Many of the people would end up just being mad at this, but how could they be mad? They knew they weren't going to even make it past the first round. They just wanted to see themselves on TV. So what good is a quirkless person going to do when they're just going to get the exact same place they're probably going to get? So they really just didn't mind it. Plus, many of these students are very, very smart and could care less. It really isn't worth their time, which they could be making hard-earned money when they could be sitting in Nezu's office arguing with him about why they were in the UA Sports Festival. If you think about it, it's just not worth their time at all. So So Izuku and everyone would end up walking out onto the field after hearing an announcement in just the speakers overhead. So they would walk out to see Midnight standing at a podium as she would then yell, "Hello, UA students and this wonderful crowd. We are about to begin the UA Sports Festival. But of course, you all competing can't really start it without knowing what the first contest is. And this just happens to be a race. There's multiple obstacles. Don't get knocked out of the race or else you'd be disqualified. Please enter this tunnel here, and once the doors open, the race is begun." As the heroes would then come out onto the field and would start pushing them into these certain tunnels, as many of the students there, along with the quirkless kids, would not really understand what any of this meant. They weren't quite sure what she was trying to get at all. So Izuku would end up seeing the gates open after being pushed into this tunnel, as he would jump up over everyone, as he was in pretty much the middle of the pack, as he would then fly straight above, as many of the students that he had taught over the weeks would end up seeing this as well before copying Izuku, jumping up and flying straight past everyone below. Bakugo, seeing this, would then jump in the air and would use his explosions. As people seeing already so many people passing them, they would start to run just very, very quickly, many of them using up all of their stamina right then and there, when this is a long race and not a sprinting one. So Izuku would end up flying right over the zero-pointers, not really caring about it at all, knowing that he'd much rather just stop a bunch of his competitors than having stopped it himself. So Izuku would then see the second area, which he would fly over once again, as he would then meet the minefield flying over it once again. Why would he spend his time doing that when he can just fly over it and do it within 5 seconds, when it would far take him around 5 minutes to do it on foot? So Izuku would end up getting first, as many of his students would end up getting second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, etc. Bakugo would end up coming in 9th place, Todoroki would end up passing at around 25th. So many of Class 1A would actually fall off, not even making it past the first round, including most of Class 1B, only being a slight few of them, and rounding it off in last place would end up being Shinso, as last place not being the last place, but 42nd place, this being the place where the very last student going on to the second round would end up being. So the second round would then just start, but not before a long waiting area, just to give all of the students a time to rest and gain back their energy. So once that waiting time was done, they would walk back onto the field, as Midnight would then start to explain the second event. So for this second event, we're going to need a point system. First place, of course, having the most points, that being 10 million. So anyone who ends up getting that is basically just an instant pass. So Izuku would end up just knowing he's about to get just targeted, but hopefully he's not going to have a problem choosing many students that he had trained to be on his team. So Izuku would end up hearing the rest of the rules, how you have to take these headbands off of other teams' heads, as there's going to be 3 people on the bottom and 1 on the top wearing the headband. So Izuku would then look around to make his team, as many of his students had already started to just go into their own teams, wanting more to beat him than to be on his team. So Izuku would see this, as he would then ask Bakugo to join him, which Bakugo would sigh and then join him, as Izuku was able to pick up 2 more of his friends/students to end up joining him on his team. So when the match would begin, Izuku standing in the middle of a circle that was just surrounded by the people targeting him, Izuku would take off his 10 million point headband before dangling it into the air, as Izuku would then get his hand in the air right next to it before making it into a keyblade and slicing it clean in half, as many of the people standing there would watch in shock, as Izuku's first place had basically just fallen right out of his hands. However, Izuku knew that the teachers were probably going to do some trick that if it were to rip in half, each half would end up being something like 5 million points. So Izuku would just do this and would then pick up the second half before tossing it into the air. Izuku would look down towards his team and would then ask them for them to just jump out of the way. So they would do this as many of the teams would rush over to see the headband lying there, as it was only one half of it. Many of them would just be in shock as they were not sure what they had just witnessed, as they would then grab it, as one of them would not really know what to do, as they would tie it around their headband and would then rush off, as many of the teams would just start fighting amongst themselves, not really knowing if the headband still counted or not, many of them believing that it wouldn't. So they would just fight amongst themselves, as Izuku's team would end up passing, having 5 million points. So when the timer would end up running out, Midnight would go back up to the podium before telling all of the teams that Izuku's team had 5 million points along with Todoroki's team, both of them tying for first place. So many of the teams there that could have picked up that 5 million point headband sitting on the ground were just in shock. They could have won there just as easy as picking up a scrap of paper off the ground. So why didn't they do it? As many of the teams would just facepalm, not knowing why they just didn't pick up the headband. After all, it was a risk that basically had no consequences whatsoever. So Izuku and his team would end up moving on to the final round, this being the 1v1 tournament. So Izuku would end up being told he was the first match up, and he was going to be versing some kid named Shinso. He was actually one of the kids in Class 1C, and it was very surprising, as Shinso was the only kid to make it from below Class 1B. As the rest were either Class 1B, Class 1A, or a bunch of the extras that had been added. So Shinso had a lot of pressure on him to perform somewhat decent for the entire sake of just the general courses. So when he would step up onto the field, Izuku would end up hearing from someone before he would even walk out of the waiting room. "So I heard you were fighting Shinso. I heard he had some type of brainwashing quirk. I wouldn't answer any of his questions, just to be safe." Izuku would nod his head before thanking his classmate, as he would then walk out onto the field, seeing Shinso waiting for him. "Do you know how hard it is to have a villain quirk? You must have it so easy, having such a glamorous, heroic quirk like yours." As Izuku would look down towards Shinso for frowning, knowing that Shinso probably had a rough life growing up, probably being bullied because he had a supposed villainous quirk. As Shinso would then reveal this to Izuku. "Do you know how hard it was? I had to grow up being bullied just because of my quirk being some villainous thing, just because I could brainwash people." As Izuku then smiled, knowing that his suspicions were correct, as Shinso, being caught up in the moment, would then realize what he had just done, as Izuku would rush towards Shinso before appearing right in front of his face. "By the looks of it, you just realized that you explained what your quirk was to me. By now you already realized you lost." As Izuku would start raising up his fist before Punch would get up, not done yet, rushing towards Izuku, as Izuku would see this before Shinso again getting up, as Izuku would decide to put Shinso out of his misery, to see that the ball had come right back at Izuku and was now spinning very rapidly on Izuku's finger. So Izuku would twist his body as he would then formulate or simulate a throw, as he would flick his finger right towards Bakugo, as this spinning orb of ki would just be sent flying right at him, as it would curve right into Bakugo's face, continuing to curve before flying off into space, as Bakugo would be sent flying down into the ground, much like Todoroki had, as he would land into a crater. However, when the dust would end up clearing, there Bakugo was, standing clear as day, as he wasn't going to give up that easy. He had had enough of just being blindsided by attacks, as he had had that happen to him during the Heroes vs. Villains, as he clearly wasn't ready for all of this hero stuff. But now he has. He's been training for months, and he was finally going to show the world his power and his capabilities as a hero. So Bakugo would charge at Izuku before throwing multiple punches in rapid succession. So Izuku would jump back, seeing that Bakugo was now just sort of in an enraged state, as his power level had gone up quite dramatically. Izuku didn't know if this was a form of ki, or if this was because of his quirk or not. So Izuku, seeing this, would end up seeing Bakugo rush at him before slamming his hands right into Izuku's cheeks, as he wasn't able to dodge this attack, as Izuku, jumping back, feeling how hard Bakugo had hit him, as Izuku would then realize something. Sensing Bakugo's power level, he would also realize that Bakugo's ki had gone up, as that what was causing Izuku to feel such power. Bakugo has been able to harness ki throughout this fight, and he was now awakening his ability to harness such a power. Izuku would then smile. His friend here had been one of the rare lucky few who was able to have a quirk and was also able to harness the ability of ki. So Izuku, rushing at Bakugo, not wanting this to last any longer, would put his arms back, putting both of his hands together as he would raise his elbow before slamming it into Bakugo's face, as Bakugo's face would then be sent flying down, smashing into the ground, as Izuku would then quickly and swiftly knock Bakugo out, as he had just been awarded the winner of the final match by Midnight. So Midnight would come up to Izuku before shaking his hand, congratulating him, as Izuku would smile as the crowd would then cheer. And that's where I'm going to leave this What If off, everyone. I'm hoping I can get part 5 out tomorrow. No promises, though. I would also like to shout out True Beta once again for making the thumbnails for the series, a link in the description to their channel, and my Twitter, where you can get extra notifications about videos and when they will be posted, and all of that is also linked in the description below. I thank you all for watching once again, and goodbye.